Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle, how are you?
Hi Caroline.
So this week has focused on dealing with the economic impacts of the coronavirus. We saw an announcement about the extension of the JobKeeper and job seeker programs, and then yesterday we had the economic update from the Treasurer. Let's start with the JobKeeper and job seeker programs. So they were legislated to expire in September, but the government says it will extend them now to recipients until March, but at a lower rate after September. What's the rationale behind the decrease in the support for recipients?
I think originally the government had hoped that it could end the JobKeeper program when it expires legislatively in September, end of September, but it's become obvious that that's just not going to fly. More help is needed. But the government does want to make a transition to get businesses, to wean businesses off all this assistance, as it puts it. And I think that this is just the first stage. The payment will go down after September, then it'll go down later and again, and there will be a tougher criteria for eligibility. So that's the rationale behind it. Now with Job Seeker, we're talking about the coronavirus supplement. Again, the government thinks that as the economy starts to open up, then you put more incentive into the system for people to look for jobs, and so the supplement's going down. There's a bit of a difference between the two programs here because the supplement is only at the moment going to the end of the year in formal terms, but nevertheless the Prime Minister's indicated that he expects it to go longer.
So there's been some criticism that decreasing, the amount available to recipients could be counterproductive, that by reducing the amount that they receive, that it could in fact hamper their ability to look for work, to get them back into the workforce. Have you got any views on that?
It's obviously a fine balance. The government wants to make sure that there are not disincentives for people to seek work. On the other hand, we know that unemployment is still going to be rising. The economic statement that came on Thursday peaked unemployment at more than 9% by the end of the year. So people are therefore searching for jobs in what's a small pool. So it's a balance between making sure there are not disincentives in the system, but also making sure that people have enough assistance and also keeping enough demand in the economy.
Okay, so look, let's go to yesterday's economic and fiscal update. I mean, it did paint a pretty bleak picture. Can you give us a quick summary of some of those headline eye-watering figures that the Treasurer outlined?
Well, what we're getting is massive deficits and debt. And of course, remember that the Coalition used to be very big on the need to have surpluses and to pay down debt. Well, all that's gone. And what we're looking at this financial year is around $184.5 billion deficit. That is very eye-watering, but absolutely necessary in present circumstances.
Is it optimistic though? There's been a lot of discussion that these forecasts are made on sort of best case scenarios of the coronavirus coming under control, that international travel might recommence, that borders might well open across Australia. So are these figures underestimating the impact?
The big uncertainty is what happens with the second wave in Victoria, and we just have no idea about that at the moment. The lockdown that is underway in Victoria is for 6 weeks. Now, if the second wave is not brought under control, that will either be extended or it'll be toughened, and that would have big implications for the assumptions underlying this document. As for the other assumptions about borders and so on, yes, they could be out. It depends whether the virus spreads again. Also, it depends, of course, in what happens in New South Wales, where they're sort of controlling the numbers, but very much on a knife edge at the moment. But the big uncertainty is Victoria.
Okay, so as you mentioned before, that the thought of such large debt, from a coalition government was sort of unthinkable, and they did punish Labor, for the debt and deficit disaster. Is Labor going to return that type of criticism this time?
Look, it's been saying all through that, of course, the coalition had been much more critical of it over the spending in the GFC than Labor is now being of the coalition. But I think we've almost moved beyond that argument. We've registered the point, but we are in such a generally catastrophic situation, frankly, that it's a question of whether the measures are appropriate to try to deal with it. Now, Labor in general endorses the measures but makes criticisms of the detail. But what it's found all through this crisis, and certainly now, is that it's really pushed to the margins of this debate. People are not interested in the political manoeuvring, they're interested in what's happening to them. And Labor is really finding it hard to get an effective voice in this general policy argument. And also, I think, it will find it hard over the next few months to pitch its own policies, because remember that while the election is due in early 2022, it could be only a bit over a year away. So Labor really has to have some alternative by then, and there's even speculation it may have to move or suspend its national conference, which is due at the end of this year because of the virus. So the whole policy devising process in the Labor Party is to an extent made extremely difficult.
Are there rumblings about, leadership, there's always rumblings about leadership, but amongst membership and Labor supporters, that they're feeling frustrated that an alternative voice really isn't cutting through? Are you getting a sense of that?
I think in the party, in the parliamentary party, there's some frustration. There's not leadership rumblings. Anthony Albanese held on at that crucial by-election, but Labor knows that it's in a very difficult position as an election approaches, but really it can't do much about that.
So one of the criticisms from Labor is where's the recovery plan, and perhaps pointing to the need for major infrastructure projects, some sort of nation-building project like a snowy hydro scheme or something. What about that? What about the plan ahead? How much do we know about that?
It's important, I think, to realise that what we saw this week, even though in the media it was characterised as a mini budget, wasn't a mini budget. It was an update of budget numbers, a startling update, as it were, because of the size of these numbers, and it was an announcement about the extension of plans already in place. The further planning, we're seeing at a couple of levels. We're seeing a series of announcements from time to time. For example, recently the announcement about training and courses for people and reform of the vocational education system. But we're also, of course, expecting a good deal in the October budget. And devising those policies will be a real challenge for the government, because clearly it wants to, for example, reform industrial relations. Now, it's got a consultative process going on, but that's only going to achieve a certain amount. And Scott Morrison has signalled that the government will bring forward legislative measures, and those will be inevitably controversial. On the question of infrastructure, you're not going to really solve these problems by just one big scheme. Yes, there'll be more infrastructure spending, and that has been already going on. But remember that a lot of the industries that are being hit are service industries, hospitality, tourism. Those people can't really necessarily move into the sort of jobs created by big infrastructure plans. So it is a very complex thing to try to grapple with.
Just with this issue of industrial relations, the union movement has signalled this morning that they're perhaps a bit cautious about the extension of this cooperation around flexibility in the workplace, to extending that further as longer term measures. Is that a potential, flashpoint in the relationship with the union movement between the government, for the government at the moment?
I think eventually there will come a point where the union movement says this far, no further, and that will be an issue, probably an election issue. And from Scott Morrison's point of view, he's got to make a fairly careful judgment here. He wants to get some reforms, and undoubtedly some reforms are highly desirable, but he will have in mind what happened to John Howard when he went too far. So it's a question of what the voters, what the community will accept.
So Parliament, the two sitting weeks were cancelled because of the coronavirus. I mean, should it have been cancelled? Does that undermine the importance of Parliament by doing that?
I think it shouldn't have been cancelled. Yes, there are great problems with the Victorian members. We saw that even with Josh Frydenberg, who's from Victoria. He was walking around Parliament House this week with a mask, or in a mask, and he had to get permission from the ACT government even to get into Canberra. But I think that it set a bad example when Scott Morrison saying we want the economy to get back to as normal as possible, and when many people in Victoria, of course, are struggling with home learning for their children. And people would say, well, if Parliament can't meet actually, it should try and meet virtually. But I think also it is possible to make arrangements for it to meet in person, albeit reduced numbers, and it should do so. And now there has been a committee set up with the presiding officers and representatives from government and opposition, and they will be discussing potential arrangements. The next sitting is late in August, or the scheduled sitting.
What options do you think they'll be considering to make Parliament work?
Both sides really want a face-to-face Parliament, even if the faces are not too close together, rather than a virtual Parliament. And I think that they will try to see how that can work, and especially with the members from Victoria.
Thanks, Michelle. I look forward to talking to you again in a fortnight.
Thanks, Caroline. Bye-bye.